Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today I'm very proud to be bringing you my newly improved dungeon and raids build for the Crusader class. Now this build is extremely strong, and just when we thought that the old build was already very strong, Blizzard released some new essence for the Crusader class which actually ended up making this build even stronger, and I'll be showcasing the build in this video and also making comparisons to how it does against the old build, and also my choices for the essence and set pieces. So let's jump right into it. For the skills, I'm using Holy Banner, I'm using Drawn Quarter, Condemn, Judgment. In my old build I was using Falling Sword here, but now with the new Shoulders Essence, the Aura of Judgment is extremely powerful. For the primary attack I'm using Sacred Fire. In my old dungeon build I was using Punish, but Sacred Fire works extremely well because of the new offhand essence which I'll be talking about. So let's move on to talk about the essence choices which I have. So we're using Iron Ignition, which is the same as my old dungeon build. This is pretty much essential for this build. It's the Fire Holy Banner, and it applies a burn effect not only to you but also to your summons. So we've got the Echoing Shade as well as the Horses from the Drawn Quarter, and it will also buff your party members, of course, so this is extremely good to have, and I don't see this essence ever being changed. For the chest piece, we're using Acolyte's Rebuke. This works with the Condemn skill, and every time you use your primary attack, it's basically unleashing a lightning bolt on the target, and this means that you can keep applying the Condemn effect, which works very well with the offhand, which is Torrential Refrain. This does a huge amount of damage. What this does is that it basically resolves all of the continual damage effects. So every time you apply a burn from the Burning Banner or from the Angman set, which I'll talk about, it gets resolved almost immediately when the Condemn is triggered. So rather than it doing damage over time, you'll be doing a huge burst of damage, which works very well with this build. So for the shoulders, we're using the newly released Upturn Gaze Essence, which works with the Judgment skill, and it reads, Judgment now grants you an aura of judgment, marking nearby enemies with a cross and slowing them and causing them to take additional damage. So the slow effect isn't really that useful for PvE, but the additional damage is incredibly good, and it will proc every time you strike an enemy with your primary attack. And because we're using the new offhand essence, the Resplendent Mane, this basically buffs your primary attack speed by 30%. So it says Sacred Fire now increases your primary attack by 10% for 2 seconds, and this stacks up to 3 times. So you have this increased 30% speed of Sacred Fire, which will basically proc your aura a lot more often, and this aura does quite a substantial amount of damage. If we look in the skills here, you can see that on Judgment it's doing 10,256 damage every time you strike an enemy with the primary attack, which actually adds up quite a bit, and you'll see in the damage breakdown, which I'll do later, that it's actually doing quite a lot of damage compared to Falling Sword, which I had in the old dungeon build. So let's continue with the essence now. So we're still using Light Striders here for the pants. This just works very well, having the 2 extra horses as a summon, and they get buffed by your burning helmet. This works very well, so I wouldn't recommend switching out. For the main hand essence, we're actually using the Sacred Fire combo, so we're using the Bristle and also Horn Splitter. These work very well and also will give you extra range over Punish. So this reads, Sacred Fire hurls waves of flame, dealing damage to all enemies in the path, and this one reads that it ignites them and applies a burn effect, which actually does pretty decent damage as well. So having this combo as well as the new offhand essence works very well with Sacred Fire in this build, and it just makes everything do an insane amount of damage. There's just really good synergy with Condemn here as well as Judgment. To top it off, you've got the Banner, of course, which is doing the most amount of damage because it's buffing everything on your skill bar. For the set pieces, I pretty much tested every single combination imaginable, so I'm pretty confident to say that these are the best set choices to have for this build. And we're using 2-piece v2, which gives you 30% increased beneficial effect duration, which works very well with this build because everything is pretty much giving you a beneficial effect. We're also using the 2-piece Feasting Baron, which gives an increased duration to harmful effects by 30%. This works incredibly well with the Torrential Refrain, and I think it's a very underrated combo and overlooked by quite a few Crusaders, and it just does an insane amount of damage. I really recommend trying it out if you haven't already. And we're also using 4-piece Angman in this build. So in my old dungeon build, I was actually using 4-piece Vithus and 2-piece Banquet. over this 4-piece Angman. But now that we have the increased primary attack speed from the new offhand, we no longer need this increased attack speed from the 4-piece v2s, and having 4-piece Angman just makes everything do an insane amount more damage, because it basically gives you a 30% additional duration of the ignite, and it also gives you this extra damage when you deal damage with your primary or attack skills. For the legendary gems, I'm using Mother's Lament, Howler's Call with Gloomcast Auxiliary, Bloodsoaked Jade, Echoing Shade, which I would not recommend switching out in this build. If you have it, at least I would try to get it to rank 3, which will provide you with 2 shadow summons, so it would be really good to have this for your fire banner. I'm using Svensson's Haunting with the new gem as the auxiliary Roiling Consequence. It works very well with this build and gives you the increased critical hit chance, and since you're using the fire banner rather than the crit banner, this is extremely good. I'm using Bottled Hope, which doesn't really need any introduction. It's one of the best gems in the game. It gives you a increased damage when you apply a buff, and also increased movement speed. And I'm using Seeping Bow with the Void Spark Auxiliary. This actually surprised me with how much damage it does, and I wouldn't really recommend switching this out for anything. It has kind of a nice AoE effect, and it can jump to many different targets, which helps you clearing all the different mobs on the screen. Maybe if you have like a Viper's Bite or the 1-star gem Misery Elixir, also works very well here. And then for the last slot, I'm using Pain Clasp, which is probably the best 2-star legendary gem in the game. It gives you 24% additional damage to enemies suffering from continual damage effect, and you're always applying a continual damage effect with this gem, so it's just a very strong gem to have in this setup. If you're free to play or low spender, there's quite a few lower resonance options which work incredibly well with this build. For the 1-star gems, I could recommend Berserker's Eye, which works very nicely, giving you flat damage. Also, Misery Elixir works very well to increase your continual damage duration. Everlasting Torment works also nicely because it's a continual damage dot effect and also increases your attack speed. For the 2-star gems, Viper's Bite works very well. Fervent Fang works very well. Igneous Scorn could also work pretty decently. There's quite a lot of different options you could use for this build, which will work very well, so I would just suggest to work with what you have. This build is definitely viable for low resonance players, so I wouldn't be discouraged playing this one. Let's quickly talk about the Reforges I have for this build. So I haven't really changed these much, and I'm not really planning to change it because I'm trying to save up my Reforge stones just in case they add extra gear ranks in the future, which I could see them doing for the next major update with the new class. So this is what I'm using here. I'm using 3 pieces of Vengeance set, which gives you increased damage for your primary attack, which works very well with this build. I'm using Beneficial Effect Duration, and I'm using primary attack damage, which works very well because this build does a very nice bit of damage with the Sacred Fire. So I'm using pretty much this setup on every single piece here. For the Awakenings, which we can also quickly talk about, having Awakenings is not necessary, but it definitely is nice to have on this build. The piece I would recommend having Awakening on the most would be the Helmet, because this gives you Holy Banner cooldown reduction by 10%. Also, another one which gives cooldown reduction would be the Light Striders. This gives you 10% cooldown of a Drawn Quarter, which is also pretty nice. But what's really nice is that these 3 pieces here, which all work with Sacred Fire, give you 10% Sacred Fire damage, and Sacred Fire actually does quite a decent amount of damage in this build. I think it's the 2nd highest damage after the Holy Banner, so getting these 3 is actually very nice after you get your banner. As for the rest of the essence, this will give you 10% Judgment, and these 2 will give you 10% Condemn damage, so you could also go for them, but they would probably be a bit lower priority to get in my opinion. I want to go through the magic attributes which I'm using because I think it's very important for this build and I definitely wouldn't skip it. So the most important magic attribute to have is cooldown reduction, and I have 20%. This is coming 3% from my Bottled Hope, 5% from my amulet here, 4% from my gloves, and 4% also from both my rings here. So because I got my cooldown up to 20%, I actually have maximum cooldown reduction of Holy Banner, because this gives me an extra 10% cooldown reduction from the Awakening, and if you didn't know, the maximum amount of cooldown reduction you can have to a single skill is 30%. So I actually have 20% cooldown to Condemn, Horse, and also Judgment, and 30% cooldown, which is the maximum cooldown to Banner. And this ends up letting you have almost 100% uptime of both Judgment and Condemn, which is really good, and a very high uptime of the horse as well as the Holy Banner, which is also extremely good. The second most important magic attribute is Beneficial Effect Duration, which unfortunately isn't shown here, but I have Beneficial Effect Duration pretty much on every slot, which is where it's possible. So I have it on the belt, I have it on the boots, I have it on chest here, I have it on pants, and I also have it, like I mentioned, in all of the Reforges. You can get up to 30%. You also get a very high amount of Beneficial Effect Duration boost from your two-piece v2s, so I definitely wouldn't recommend skipping or trying to get it everywhere. You could also go for the 1-star gem, which I didn't mention before, which is the Blessed Pebble. It would also be very nice to have in this build if you are running that one. For the Paragon tree, it comes as no surprise that I'm still using the Weaver Paragon tree. This is just too strong to pass on, and it's giving you increased crit chance as well as the increased damage, which you'll have stacking up pretty fast since you're spamming your skills as well as your primary attack. So before I go through how I like to adjust this build for dungeon play, I'm actually going to do a side-by-side comparison of the raid build from my old guide, and you guys can see just how much damage increase I'm doing with the new build. So I have the old build, which I showcased in my previous guide, on the left, and the new build on the right, and let's just do a 10 seconds damage rotation and compare them. So as you can see here, the new build actually outperforms the old one by about 1.5 extra million damage per second. Let's take a quick look at the damage breakdown. So if we just compare the old build to the new build, I'm now using Sacred Fire compared to Punish, and with the new essence, Sacred Fire is actually doing considerably more damage compared to Punish, so my primary attack is doing a lot more damage. Like I mentioned, we've also replaced Falling Sword with Judgment here, and this is doing 4 times more damage. So these are definitely the new stars of the show. We have Sacred Fire for the primary attack and Judgment. Obviously the banner is still doing the most amount of damage because it just buffs everything and gives it the burning effect. But it's really insane to see how well this build synergizes together, and now we have 2 new skills which are doing even more damage. So now that we've gone over the new raids build, we can now talk about the dungeon variation, which I like to play. So this actually uses the raid build as the base, and if you've seen my last video, I mentioned that what I like to have in dungeons is a bit more mobility. So the raids build does incredible damage, but it just doesn't have that mobility. So what I actually recommended in my last video was that people use the Quiz of Scorn pants, which is the extra condemn damage pants, and then they can use Drawn Quarter without any essence, just as the vanilla horse, just to move around the dungeon. But now we actually have this new essence, which is the Harass of the Steps, and let me tell you, this essence is absolutely insane. So let's just take a closer look at what this actually does in the skills menu here. What this does is Drawn Quarter now mounts you atop of a Swift Twin Steed, which is the white horse, for 6 seconds. So this is already higher base than the vanilla horse, which is only lasting for 5 seconds. This is like the yellow aura horse, which we have the Galloping Stride essence. So it has a longer duration, which is really good. It also increases your primary attack speed by 40%. That's just a monster amount increase. And it also leaves behind Gusts of Wind that will increase the movement speed of your allies by 40%. This is just absolutely bonkers. It just provides so many buffs to your party, and this 40% is actually really insane, and it works comparable to the Sacred Fire increase attack speed. So it's actually better than the Sacred Fire increase attack speed, because this only goes up to 30%, and this will allow you to go up to 40%. Now, granted, you won't be able to use the Sacred Fire main hands because you'll be riding on top of a horse, but from my testing, this actually gave pretty much almost identical damage compared to this Sacred Fire. So it's actually really good to be on top of the horse now. In most Crusader builds, you actually do more damage when you're unmounted and you're off your horse, but with this new essence, you're actually doing more damage while riding on the horse, and you have more mobility, which is just completely insane to me. I would definitely recommend farming up this essence if you haven't already and trying it out, because this is just absolutely crazy. So other than that, the only other thing I've done is that I've moved the Awakening from the Sacred Fire damage slot to the Drawn Quarter cooldown here. So this allows me to have an extra 10% of Drawn Quarter cooldown, and because I already have the 20% cooldown, like I said, this actually maxes out my Drawn Quarter cooldown, so I end up having something like 1 second downtime, which is really nice because, like I said, I want to be on top of the horse most of the time. So something important I want to mention is with the gameplay of this build. So both Judgment and Condemn can both be cast while on top of the horse. So you can just move around like this, but the annoying thing is that the banner will actually dismount you from the horse. So if I just press it here, you can see that I get dismounted off the horse, and I end up doing slightly less damage because I'm off the horse and I'm losing my 40% increased attack speed. So what I like to do to solve this problem is I actually like to put banner on my first skill, and this means that every time I'm pressing banner before I mount on top of the horse, and then once you're like this, you can then press your condemn and your judgment and just ride around, and you'll have no problems at all, and you'll be buffing your teammates as well. So one thing you'll notice is that the cooldown of drawn quarter and banner is mismatched. So as you can see now, I have my drawn quarter and I got banner about 4 seconds later. So you will need to give it some thought about when you press banner, and if you're already on top of the horse, sometimes I would recommend actually holding off from pressing banner because it will dismount you, and just waiting until the horse cooldown ends so that you can once again match the cooldown of both the horse and the banner, and this will make the gameplay a lot smoother. If you didn't know, the primary attack while riding on top of the horse is actually a different primary attack compared to the Sacred Fire, which we've set. So having these two essence here isn't actually that useful if you have very high cooldown and beneficial effect duration, but I'd still recommend having these because there's not really any other good options, and you still want to be doing a decent amount of damage just in case you do get knocked off your horse, or if you can't really get your hands on pieces with high cooldown or high beneficial effect duration. So now let's quickly do a damage test for this dungeon build. So for a 10-second damage rotation, we can see that the damage output is 5.4 million damage per second. So even though the damage has gone down slightly, you have to remember that you've gained an incredible amount of mobility, as well as also buffing the mobility of your teammates. So this is an incredibly good build, and this damage number is still incredibly high, and actually you can compare this to my old raids build, not even the dungeon build. My old raids build had slightly less damage than this, so I'd really recommend you guys to give this build a try, and now I'll be showing how the gameplay works in a dungeon. So we're just going to do an Inferno 6 Cavern of Echoes solo run here and see how it performs. So like I said, you always want to be pressing banner just before you mount your horse, because that allows you not to dismount when you have to press it again. So this actually melts mobs just as I'm moving through, which is really nice to see. And here I'm dismounted off my horse, so I'll just wait a bit to get my horse and banner cooldown matched again. But it's still actually doing very nice damage even while I'm dismounted off the horse. So here I'll just wait for the boss to arrive before I press my banner on horse. Okay. And as you can see, this is absolutely melting through the boss while I'm mounted on top of the horse, which is really nice to see. And my mobility is incredibly good. So in moments like these where, as you can see, I just got my banner, I'm not actually pressing it, and I'm going to hold off pressing it until I get the horse back on, because I don't want to get dismounted. So now we press banner and then horse again. And we'll just move to the end of the dungeon here. This just does really nice damage. And here we are, just going to move through to the boss. So even without banner, I'm still doing very decent damage on these mobs, which is really nice to see. And as with the last build, you kind of want to be using your primary attack just to spawn the clones. This will also buff your attack speed because of the offhand. And let's see how fast this boss melts. Wow, that is just insane. That was some nice crits there. So yeah, this build is incredibly good, and it also has a buff to your drops. As you can see, I got a green, so it's very nice to play, and I would definitely recommend using this one, guys. So I had a few people asking me about Challenge Rift builds for Crusader, and I have to say that this build actually works extremely well for Challenge Rifts too. You could always switch out for more damage in the Raids build using the Armory Pair once you reach the boss, but just for clearing the mobs in the Challenge Rift, this build actually works very, very well, and I'd recommend using this dungeon setup for Challenge Rifts too. So before I end the video, I want to mention a few tips and tricks as well as the Gauntlet build, which I like to use, which is very similar to this build. So first of all, there is a Shoulder's Essence, which is extremely powerful in this game, which is called the Folly of Zakharoon. This is really, really good because it gives you a 39% increase duration of banner. So you could always switch out this new Shoulder's Essence to this Folly of Zakarum, and then this frees up a skill slot. And what you could do is you could switch out the Bristle for the Luminous Rain, which will allow you to use the Falling Sword. I tried using the Sweep attack here with the new main hand Essence, but it just didn't perform as good as I'd liked. So this is the second best option. And so you could switch out the Judgment for Falling Sword here and play with this build, and this would allow you to have an increased duration of banner, which is always nice to have. But I just really like playing with the new Judgment Essence, to be honest. But this is also a very good option in case you like the increased banner duration here. The other tip which I'd like to mention, which I already shared in my previous video, is that if you have another Crusader with the Aaron Ignition helmet, there's no point also running the Aaron Ignition helmet. So what you could do is you could run the crit banner with the Arrow Keeper helmet here, and that would also kind of stack with the fire banner and also provide a lot more damage for you and your party. So this is the one that you want to use just in case you have another Crusader in the party. So aside from that, I could also share the Gauntlet build, which I like to use. So let's go over that quickly. So it's this one here. So all I've done here is that I'm using the same setup as my raid setup. So we've got the Light Striders and we've got the Awakening on the Sacred Fire damage here. So we're using the Folly of Zakarum here. Because Gauntlet takes quite a long time to finish, you actually want to have this increased banner duration here. So I switched out the Judgment for this because it just has an increased buff to all your party members, which is really nice and really good to have. And in this case, we're still using the Bristle and the Horn Splitter here, but what I've done is I've switched out the free skill slot to Conjuration of Light, which will give you an extra immune. So it's very minor changes compared to the raids build. Everything else pretty much remains the same. But with that said, guys, I hope that this video has been useful. I'm very happy with how this dungeon build turned out, and I'm really glad for these new Crusader Essence which we have. So I will be playing around with these new Essence and trying to figure out a really nice PvP build for you guys. But for now, I'll be signing off. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you all in the next one.